And chief among the people making a contribution with his time and effort is Jeff Katz, who's going to be the host of the museum's panel today, and who pulled it all together. And it's a pleasure for me to welcome him to the stage now, and he'll introduce the panel. Thanks very much, Jeff.
Good afternoon. Today we're going to have a very interesting discussion about the development and marketing of the industry's first commercially successful flash memory. Before I get into exactly what's that, let me take a show of hands. If you do not know what the words non-volatile memory mean, please raise your hand. Oh, good. The four people that you see here, whom you can take a seat, folks. I'm going to introduce you in just a moment individually, and if you feel like standing up then you can. The four people that you see here were largely responsible for that first commercially successful flash memory chip. The flash combined the non-volatility and the relatively low cost of the EEPROM, which was hard to alter, with the similar non-volatility but easier to alter and very expensive E2 PROM. And so it opened up a new niche in the market, in the memory hierarchy, which the computer makers of the time could take full advantage of, and we hope to hear more about how they did that. These folks did not invent the flash concept. That was invented several years earlier than the events we're going to talk about today at Toshiba by, I got to say the name correctly, Fujio Masuoka. He did that in 1984. By 1986, one of our panelists and a few other folks had invented Intel's version of the flash, the ETOX cell, ETOX. And that was done by Stefan Lai, who is the second from your left, and I'll give you more detail on him in a moment, working with his colleagues Vin Dom and Simon Tam. It was then, in the next couple of years later, that the rest of this team took that ETOX cell and turned it into the first commercially successful flash memory. That memory became an industry standard and was for a long time a major revenue maker for Intel. It is no longer the industry leader. It has been surpassed by a different architecture. The original was called NOR architecture. The current industry leader is NAND architecture. But for more than a decade, that NOR architecture that this team put together was the industry standard and generated lots of money for Intel and for others. So I'd like to introduce our four panelists today. At your far left is Mr. Dick Pashley. Dick grew up in a traveling military family. He had a BS EE from the University of Colorado and a PhD in EE from Caltech. Interestingly, there he was studying under one of our CHM fellows, Mr. Carver Mead, Dr. Carver Mead. He spent his entire career working at Intel, first in technology development and later as the general manager and the director for Intel's non-volatile memory business and their product development there. The next panelist is Stefan Lai. He grew up in Hong Kong. He has a BS in physics from Caltech, where, interestingly enough, he was his graduate student assistant happened to be Dick Pashley. Or at least a lab assistant or something, I don't know. Stefan has a PhD in physics from Yale University. He had an early career at IBM in device physics, and later he was recruited into Intel's technology development department, where he worked for about 24 years until he left in 2006 to become a VP of business development at Ovonix. And he's currently working on starting a new phase change memory company. Our next panelist is Niles Kynett, who grew up in northeastern Ohio. He has a BSEE from University of Cincinnati. He too spent his entire career at Intel, first as a DRAM chip designer, later as a microprocessor chip designer, and finally as a non-volatile memory chip designer. Our final panelist is Bruce McCormick, on your right. Bruce grew up also in the Midwest. He has a BSEE and a MSEE from Purdue University and an MBA from Santa Clara University. He too has spent his entire career, which isn't yet completed, at Intel. First as a product engineer, later as a microprocessor product marketer, and finally directing the marketing and strategic planning for Intel's non-volatile memories. So we have a very good team here for our panel. I think with that, I'd like to sit down and start the panel discussion. I'd like to start, am I mic'd here? Can you hear me? Okay, good. I'd like to start with Dick. Can you, you were involved since way before the beginning of this flash exercise. Can you give us a little context for what was the non-volatile memory situation in the industry and at Intel in the early to mid-'80s?
In the early to mid-'80s, the EEPROM was the product that was in the highest volume. And that product, customers were growing weary of having to do a UV erase every time they wanted to reprogram the device. And a new device had come out called the E², which was electrically erasable. And this did everything the customers wanted except for one thing. And that was the price was about 8 times per bit of the EEPROM. So their response back was, we really like this E², but we'd like to have it at the same price per bit as the EEPROM. So at Intel, at Toshiba, and many other companies, the search was on for what we coined the holy grail of non-volatile memory, which is the single transistor cell that resulted in the flash memory. Toshiba was the first to market. They came out with a product that was very innovative, but they could not build it in volume and had a lot of technical problems. At Intel, we actually took 2 approaches. One approach Stefan had come up with his engineers, and it was the ETOC cell. And internally, we thought that was the best chance to get there. But upper management thought we should be looking at another approach. And Xicor, a company that was separate from Intel, but started by some ex-Intel employees, had an idea for a single transistor E². So we had a partnership with Xicor, which lasted about 2 years. And this partnership never resulted in a product because the cell was very difficult to manufacture again. But meanwhile, in the lab, Stefan kept plugging away. And he came up with a cell that actually worked.
So, yeah, Stefan, tell us about that. And also tell us something about the insight that led you to that cell.
In fact, you know, Jeff was asking me whether there's any aha moment. There was not. When I joined Intel, I actually never had any chip experience. I was doing research at IBM. And so when I came in, there was a program called Advanced E² program. And that program was looking at a approach which used external injectors for programming. But it didn't work. There's some scaling problem. And so I was just looking at a solution, and then I look at the existing EEPROM cell and say that we already have a device that has the programming working already. So the only problem we need to solve was how to erase. In fact, the first cell I drew up has a separate program and a separate tunnel erase region, just like in the tunnel ETOC cell, I mean the FlowTOC cell. But Windam was the one who suggested that why do you need an extra area? You should just put the erase area under the channel. And voila, that's the cell that was born. It's extremely simple. It's just like the EEPROM cell. And we demonstrated it working in a very short time. In fact, in a few months' time, because there's something already running. And, but it did take a much longer time for us to work out all the manufacturing bugs.
So at the time of the cell invention, did you have an inclination about what its ultimate impact on computing would be?
No, in fact, when we have something working, we took it to the division of Infosum, and we showed them that this is a wonderful small cell. It's electrically erasable. The only problem is you have to erase a large block of it. And what they told me is, no, we do not want that. The customer wants byte erase. What you have does not work, and in fact, that's why we started a cycle program, because that's what gives the byte erase function. But the byte erase function was too expensive, and so we stick with our simple cell, and it worked.
I'd like to continue this contextual discussion here, and skip over to Bruce. Can you tell us what the competitors were doing in non-volatile memory in the mid-'80s?
Well, everybody was focused on the mainstream markets, of course, but the other thing that was going on at that time is the Japanese companies were looking to pretty much own the memory businesses. And so there was a lot of stress in the industry. That was also the time when you had the anti-dumping going on. So part of this was born out of the need for innovation, I believe. But the E-squared businesses were still small in the markets because of what Dick brought up as the expense of the technology. And EEPROM was still Intel's, they were number one in that. And but there was a lot of business stress in that particular year.
Okay. So. I'd like to get into the development program. Let me just go back to Dick here. We know that Intel did have other priorities in non-volatile memory at the time. How did the senior management finally get convinced to work on Flash?
Well, I think Stefan talked about our experience when we went up to the Memory Components Division, and I was in technology development at the time with Stefan. And we made this presentation, and we were actually shocked. We thought we had a memory that was ideal, and the response was basically sour grapes. We were told that Toshiba failed, so why should we invest in this? And the other reason was, ironically, it would cannibalize Intel's EEPROM business. And we're scratching our head and going, isn't it better that we cannibalize our own business than someone else? But we didn't say that. We went back to Santa Clara, and I set up a luncheon with Gordon Moore, and Stefan made a presentation. And during this presentation, Gordon made a very astute observation, and he said, Flash is a disruptive technology. And clearly he understood what the potential of Flash could offer. And about 2 weeks later, I got a phone call, and I was asked if I wanted to leave the technical side of Intel and basically do a startup. And while that sounds exciting for someone that's been technical their entire career, it was a little foreboding. I mean, I had to think about it for a week or two, and I talked to Stefan and ended up making the decision to do it. And the rest, a lot of hard work and a lot of credit goes to the people you see here, but I think Gordon deserves most of the credit for at least allowing the people at Intel to work on Flash and turn it into a product.
Okay, let's move into how the project got organized. Niles, can you give us a little sense? We understand that there was another program in process with the Xicor design. How did you manage to get this one going?
Well, the E-squared eventually was killed. So we had designers there that were available, and we had already formed the core of this team. And as Dick pointed out, we had a startup mentality, which I think was absolutely key, because the people that we brought into the group, it was kind of an us against the world attitude.
How big was the group?
We had 5 or 6 design engineers total, myself, a couple marketing guys, a couple of PEs. It was small.
But certainly by Intel standards, yeah, or current Intel standards.
By current Intel standards, we'd put us all in the closet. And I think they tried, but it did help out a lot keeping us out of the closet.
So you were working sort of under the radar in parallel with the other project?
Well, we were definitely, there was some work going on under the radar. My team really popped up as soon as the E-squared project was killed, we popped up right into it. And so we got our hands in really pretty much at the beginning of the definitions of everything, which is where I had one of the aha moments, I think, because I was a frustrated microprocessor design engineer. As you mentioned, I'd been on some microprocessor projects in the past, and I saw the E-squared and said, hey, Dick, it's a little more expensive than EEPROM, right? He goes, yeah, the flash is a little bit more expensive. I says, okay. And it races electrically, right? He goes, yeah. I says, well, why don't we make it so a microprocessor can talk to it and do all the race and program algorithms? And he scratched his head and says, well, that might not be a bad idea. So, that really differentiated ourselves. But that was kind of thinking that we had in the group. We were startups, so we were on our own. Nobody was really looking over our shoulders. We did pop up above the radar screen every once in a while. Andy Grove would come up and want a review to see where he was spending his money. And he had some tough questions for us from time to time.
Which apparently you could answer.
We guessed, and a couple of good guesses.
So at that time, you did have a sense then for how the computer industry would absorb your technology.
Well, I think Dick pointed out the first place we knew we were going to go to was the same customers that were using EEPROM. And I thought at that time that the way that the EEPROM model was is that you had to take it out of a board, take it over to UV erase it, these big PROM programmers, and all the capability was really there between an 88 or an 81, 86, a very, very low performance microprocessor, especially to today's standards, and it had all the intelligence it needed right in the system so that you didn't have to pull the chip out of the socket. So I think that's where some of the ideas really started.
Let me come back to Bruce here a little bit. I know you had some insights about how the product could be used in computing and other electronic applications. Did your insights come to pass? And if so, how long did it take? And which was the first indication it would work?
Well, early on, in '86 actually, started looking at the technology. My particular background is in computer architecture. And when I first looked at it, I said, well, this is a hard to rewrite EEPROM. What do you do with that? And then there was a time when I looked at it upside down and said, this is a block alterable non-volatile RAM. How would you architect a computer around that? And we came to the realization of our team that we had something that really was a breakthrough for many types of applications. And one of the companies we went to right off the bat was IBM. And it was one of those times where you had operating system people and system designers connected with our circuit design guys as well as our process technologists, where they could sit down and talk together and try to figure out how do you organize an overall system to make maximum advantage of this. And it was IBM Austin, they were looking at making a solid state computer out of this technology. And this was in '86. So
only about 20 years sooner than it actually happened.
It's still, so we had radical thinking, or at least some of us did, of executing directly from your backup store and caching your writes, which is the opposite of the way computers typically
clearly
work.
those things didn't happen all at first. What
Correct.
did the first customers do with the product?
Okay, one more before we launched was we went to Kodak as well. Dick and I was there because we knew what would happen to the photography industry as a result of this. And we had a demo, and we said it was a decade away in terms of impacting that industry, but we gave them a heads up. And a key guy named Tim Treadwell, I believe, there at Kodak in New York. They got started early before we actually announced our first products to start looking at digital photography. But the real applications, when we launched, were much humbler, and along the lines of what Niles just communicated, we're updating EEPROMs or data logging. Schlumberger used it in their downhole well kind of things. Tektronix was one of the first ones to use it for their oscilloscopes, for updating memory. We had medical instrumentation equipment and other things. So
Cell phones came along just a little later.
Cell phones
Yeah,
came a
cell
little
phones.
later.
So how did you get customers to accept it or try it?
Well,
I presume you were all
I'm
involved.
sure we all have some stories here, so this is kind of the fun part of the technology. But you were either disrupting a business model or disrupting a memory hierarchy in a lot of customers' applications. And so a lot of times we had to go to a customer's competitor to get them, somebody who was hungry and excited, that would take a risk and do something different, and then set the expectations of their customers of what this technology can do, and they had to follow suit. In some cases, we weren't successful with that. I don't know if I can give a couple examples here, but we'll come back to that. But to give you one example.
I'd like to hear what resistance there was to your new concept, and I understand that you're disrupting some of their methods of working.
Okay.
But were there technical objections as well? And just how did you overcome all that?
For the technology to be used as a storage device, we had to come up with a flash filing system. It was a very complicated piece of software that we had to develop. So that was a technical hurdle we had to get over and make that available so people could use it in that kind of way. But from a business model standpoint, to give you an example, one that did work, postal meters had everything, as Niles pointed out, in the system to update the rates of which you, when you put something on the scale and it gets so much postage on it, the rate tables were stored in an EEPROM. Well, this system already had a phone link into it, so it had a way of communicating from the office to update it. But if you went to the management of that company and said, hey, why don't you use Flash, and then you can, instead of driving out there with these trucks and popping the lid and taking the old EEPROM tables out, putting in a new one, you can do it remotely. The trouble was, the manager that would run all the trucks was his own P&L center, right? And you were disrupting his business. And you go to his boss, it might have been the president of the company, and he would say, I'm not going to overturn my people's thinking. So, and you sit there and say, well, you can keep your people and charge the same amount, but you don't have to spend the money on gas. But those kind of situations you fix by going to their competitor. But the other one, which was an interesting one, which didn't happen, which was another business model, was a Blockbuster. And this was very early on as well. Worked with IBM and us to change games. The game cartridges was it's a ROM business, and they set up stores in Florida where they manufactured the game cartridge in the store. So there was never an inventory problem. The customer always had it available because they manufactured it right there in the store. It was a benefit to the game manufacturer. They had a lot more flexibility as to what they could do, and it was a lot cheaper business model. Everybody benefited.
Why didn't it succeed?
Because everybody benefited except a very small group of people that actually controlled the rights of the games themselves, and they lost control of the. They believe they lose the control
Of distribution.
of the distribution because they were controlling it through ROM. And we experienced the same thing with the music industry. We went after MP3 players. We were looking into video, which was longer term out, but books. We were looking at an electronic book. We tried to get that business going. And book titles is another tightly held IP that would block business models.
Okay, well, so we hear of a number of places where it didn't succeed at first, but clearly it did succeed in enough places that it became a good business.
Yes.
Let me ask Dick or Stefan, why do you think this succeeded where Toshiba's didn't?
I think we have a focus on cost and scalability. And the Toshiba, they just trying to bring, on the hand though, they did bring out NAND. The guy who invented, Masuoka-san, invented the first one didn't work. He went back then invented the NAND. which now sort of takes over the whole flash business.
Well, I presume, though, at that time there weren't digital cameras and MP3 players to use the NAND architecture, which is ideally suited to them.
Well, it's more than that, though. The reason why the NAND is a problem is because NAND is not a perfect memory. And for all our applications, we need a perfect memory. NAND
Those applications were?
For all the memory card application, they have a controller that can fix the defect.
No, I'm talking about the applications for which you needed the perfect memory.
Oh, for all the program stores.
Program
like
storage.
Cell phone,
yes.
like when you boot up a computer, you want the memory to be perfect.
Okay.
I'll go ahead and add to that. I think that one of the keys was we only did things that we knew we could manage. So we controlled the risk. If you look at all the products that we developed, we learned to walk before we ran. And Toshiba, the NAND cell was very, very ambitious. And it turned out to be the best cell in the long run. But they didn't have a product for roughly 10 years after the cell was invented. Whereas at Intel, our cell was based on the EEPROM. And correct me if I'm wrong, Stefan, wasn't there like 95% of the manufacturing steps were the same as EEPROM?
That's correct.
So that meant you could take an EEPROM factory, and of course we did this, convert it from building EEPROMs to flash, and we could do it in a matter of weeks. The same was true of the product designs. The initial products were very simple, but as time evolved, more and more features were put on them. First, believe it or not, they weren't 5-volt only memories. That only occurred later. So if you ask me, I think the key thing that we did is we learned to manage the risk and develop products quickly. So we got products to market within a matter of 6 months after the design started. And they all worked, I mean, correct me, didn't they all work the first time?
Yeah, I can add to that. One of the things Dick and his staff was very, very good at is that we formed a development team early on, and that had all the functions: marketing, manufacturing, design. Everybody was in those teams, and we had a cutoff date. Beyond that cutoff date, we weren't accepting any new features to the product. So that was it. The features would have to go on the next chip, unless that feature was a showstopper of some kind, which we never really ran into. But I can remember one meeting that I went into, and again, I'm a frustrated microprocessor designer in a memory group. I wanted to put logic on this chip, and these guys, logic, oh my God, the customers never pay for that. Of course, the answer was the customers didn't pay for it, but it became a cost of doing business. So one of my engineers and I had an idea that, well, you know, it's pretty bad to have the microprocessor hung up trying to do the program erase algorithm, so I wanted to put a write state machine inside the flash so that simple commands could go to the flash would do its work and free up the microprocessor to do more important things. And this idea came around for a while, and finally, in one of Dick's Friday staff meetings, Bruce McCormick was sitting in the corner, and he throws his hands up and he goes, okay, you want to put this thing in? You think it's valuable? Says, yeah, I do. He says, okay, but you better be right.
He was.
Well, you know, the write state machine, it was in all of our products after that. The same instructions that we used, the first flashes, are still used in NAND today. So I at least think we can claim a legacy from the NOR structures into NAND that's there today.
Well, this is interesting. We've now heard about several attributes of the memory that made it attractive to customers. One is its low cost, like EEPROMs. One was its non-imperfections, like NAND would have had. One is this on-chip state machines that make it easier to use. Was there any single attribute, I'll ask all of you to comment, that seemed to be the thing that customers decided they couldn't live without, and that's what made them fall in love with the chip? Tough question?
No, it's a whole in-system reprogrammability that makes it so unique.
Well, yeah, I think it's form factor and reliability, because you can't have your iPods if you're carrying around a mini disk. You know, you have to have flash in that, and they have to be a low enough cost with a high enough density to hit the trigger point of usefulness for those machines. So, you know, the form factor, the reliability, and the cost, and the density. That's what I think probably, I don't think I can take it down to one thing, but this would probably be the 4 top ones.
I'll give one to that. I think key was cost. Because if you look at all the alternatives to the technology, customers that use DRAM to get non-volatility, they had a disk drive, which at the time cost a couple $100. If you used SRAM to get non-volatility, you had a battery, and SRAM was more expensive. If you had E2 PROM, it was more expensive. If you had an EPROM, you couldn't change it. So it actually was unique in terms of capability at a cost point. As soon as customers took advantage of it, then they had an advantage over their competitors.
So I want to add to that. You know, personally, I was responsible for 10 generations of flash development in 20 plus years, and I saw 1,000 times cost reduction during those times. It's incredible how far it's gone.
Actually, I did the numbers, and Stefan's wrong. It's over 10,000 times. I mean, absolutely amazing what Stefan and his team did.
Let's hear it for scalability.
Yeah. Yes. There's one additional thing besides cost, and I think Bruce is right on about cost, and I think Flash brought portability. If you look today at everything in your pocket or that you carry with you, I'll guarantee you Flash is in it. And Flash offered this that I don't think any other product could. And we had a lot of visions, definitely Bruce, back in the 80s of where Flash could go. And they all happened. I mean, they may not have happened in the time frame that we desired, but they're all happening. Today you can go out and you can buy a Kindle, and what's in it? 2 gigabytes of Flash. Your cell phone doesn't have a couple K of Flash these days. If you have a, yeah, it's many megs. Almost any piece of equipment you have has Flash in it. It's just absolutely amazing.
We're getting pretty close to the time when we can accept questions from the audience here. You may note that you have cards there. There'll be somebody coming around in a few minutes to pick them up. I'd like to follow up with a little bit of the comment we just had as a way we close up the discussion here, the prepared discussion, anyway. All those devices that you just mentioned do include the NAND flash. They're mostly data-centric as opposed to program-centric. And it turned out to be, as we have discovered here, a much bigger market than the program-centric original flash business. Why is it that Intel missed that? And how did they happen to not be part of this big NAND generation?
Well, this is the innovator's dilemma. The NAND is a disruptive technology in the sense that it's a completely different usage model. We have a standard NOR business to run. The revenue is coming in to divert attention development to a very small business. It does not make sense from the mainline memory business. So it just, we've seen this in the Valley again and again. But just for the record, though, we did try to get into the NAND business, and finally we did succeed. I was responsible for the, IMFT.
When was that?
This is 04, 05.
Okay.
Finally, it took a long time, but we did get into it.
And in the early 90s, NAND was a technology that most people viewed as so complex that we weren't even sure it would eventually get to market. And internally, there were lots of discussions, all 4 of us had, on this topic. And it was a tough decision to commit, let's say, half your R&D budget to a technology that you weren't sure was going to make it.
So just for the record, NAND part allowed 2% bad memory bits. And how to manage those 2%, it's a big problem for people. And it's only when the memory card comes in with the controller to manage that, then that becomes possible to have something that's sellable.
And Stefan, these weren't bits that were bad in manufacturing. These were bits that...
Over time,
yes.
It will fail in the field.
So is that what contributed to the complexity you mentioned, Dick, where you had to account for that and deal with it?
You had to deal with these bad bits. You also had to figure out how to program the device, because instead of just one cell that's an XY matrix, you have a string of cells.
Yeah.
And so to access the 32nd cell becomes difficult, and to have it work the same way as the first cell in the string
I see.
was tough to do.
So, I mean, it takes a change in paradigm of how memory is being used for NAND to take off.
Another key difference is NOR flash was random access.
Yeah.
And that has a lot of value. And we see memory technology coming here that Stefan's working on. It will bring random access back to very dense, scalable technology, we hope. So when you're not random access, you're limited to downloading into DRAM, which actually raises the system cost. So there were many arguments as to what was the right thing to be doing for the long haul.
Random access is a clear requirement for program-centric.
Correct.
For data-centric iPods, they don't care, right?
They care, but
Just their time frame is not nanoseconds. You
Yes.
can have a much longer time to get the data.
Okay, well, we have some questions here from our viewing audience. I'll wander through these here. First one is, which do you think is a bigger driver for the adoption of solid-state drives, higher performance or higher reliability? I'll let anybody who thinks they have an answer.
It's high performance.
agreed.
Yeah. Especially, I think that the server world will go to a solid-state drive. They get 100 times, 1,000 times more IOPS compared to this drive.
Here's one that says, did you have any one customer that, quote, made, end quote, your market initially?
Nokia from the days of cell phone, but there were customers early on in EEPROM replacement, and Bruce, do you remember any of those?
Well, the FedEx tracker was one that drove the package change.
Yes.
So that was a key account that used quite a large volume of the technology. To my knowledge, they're still using it today. The BIOS replacement was another way we got into the computer. And there's actually several accounts that got started on that at each different points in the product line.
Automotive too, I thought.
Automotive. So we had different key accounts in different
No
segments.
single one. Interesting.
Not.
Here's one that follows up on some of the earlier discussion. Explain perfect memory. Why is NAND memory inherently imperfect, and how do you use imperfect memory?
Well, the NAND allows 2% bad bits, and it changes over time, whereas for the detox flash, you can read from it continuously and will not get an error. We engineer the reliability into the memory cell, whereas NAND relies on it's like a disk drive analogy where you have a controller that checks it every time you read from it to make sure that whatever you read out is correct.
Yes, in disk drives, I know they have bad spots on the media,
Yeah.
and to accommodate that and deal with it, they put in cyclic redundancy, error checking codes into the data. And I presume you have to do that with NAND as well?
Yeah, they have extensive error correction in the current NAND that you buy out.
I could add a little follow-up on that, though, as well, is that when we were doing all this was 86, 87, and Intel just suffered a very large recall on a microprocessor. And so the emphasis inside of Intel on making sure that we had high reliable, high quality parts was very, very large. There was no tolerance for even a flash chip that couldn't cycle 100,000 times and retain its memory for 10 years. And you could beat on it all ways you wanted to, and as long as it was in the spec, none of our bits would be bad. And that's the standard that we had to hit with our flash part.
Yeah. This one maybe is better answered by somebody from SanDisk, but I'll get it up here anyway. If NAND is imperfect memory, are all my backups to SD chips at risk?
No, just like disk drive, everybody uses tons of disk drive. They are imperfect memory. But on the system level, they are very, very accurate, and that's because of the magic of error correction.
There's quite a lot of things that are done inside of a NAND controller to take all these kind of things into account. So if you buy your portable stick drive that goes in your computer, probably safe.
I mean, the people that developed NAND technology and learned how to put it into a system deserve a lot of credit because, as Stefan said, it's an imperfect technology. And they've managed to turn it into something to the external world that does look perfect. and it has a much lower cost structure. So that's why NAND is so pervasive today.
Here's one I think I can answer. Why was the flash breakthrough not marketed as another way to define Intel inside? I believe it predated that slogan.
Yeah, Intel designs in the 90s, right?
Yeah.
Flash is in the 80s.
Yeah.
Well, microprocessors were and still are fairly important in that company.
Indeed. But
I don't think they wanted us to dilute their
but
brand information. Yeah,
there was, I'm sure there was a different slogan in the 70s for microprocessors.
Well, you were there, so.
Yeah,
What was it?
I don't remember. There's more on NAND. Well, I think we've done NAND. Okay, well, here's one. Why choose NOR instead of NAND?
Because there was no NAND at the beginning. What we have is something that works based on EEPROM, and the architecture we have is exactly like a EEPROM, so that's why it's a NOR.
By the way, all the applications you see today were started with NOR. Scion, a company in the UK, built a solid-state computer in the early 90s, late 80s, actually.
Late 80s.
So that's 20-some years ago. And people are just now starting to reconsider those kind of concepts.
Well, and even SanDisk, that stakes their claim to NAND, all of their products up until about, I'm going to guess, 1996, were NOR products. So all the products started as NOR, and only as NAND came online in the mid-90s with its lower cost structure, did it drive things like the camera and these other applications that use data store.
Here's a question. Maybe Stefan can comment, or maybe anyone else. When will more cost-effective non-volatile memories replace flash?
I'm working on it. On the other hand, though, the momentum of NAND is so strong that it will take some time. I would think that 5 years from now you'll see a different landscape, but I hope I'll play a part in that.
And it'll be random access again, by the way. Just to let you know.
So it'll work for programs as well as iPods. Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
So NOR lives on.
Here, this is an interesting question which there may not be a current answer for. How much money did Intel spend to develop flash? How many units ultimately were sold, and what was its revenue?
You're asking cumulative?
I don't know, I presume.
We passed 1 billion units shipped in 2002 or 3. And it probably, I would say 3, 4, 5 billion. Of course, now the NOR business is no longer within Intel, it's in mnemonics now. But I would say that we ship a few billion units before it was spun out. And revenue currently is about a few $1 billion in the year 2000. And so I cannot add up what it would be, but I would say that it may be $10, $20 billion.
In cumulative
revenue.
And typically our R&D was what, 10 to 15% of that number, so probably $1.5 billion, maybe $2 billion in R&D, as a guess.
I didn't spend that much money.
In the early days we definitely did.
By the way, Intel still, we own like 45% of mnemonics, and we're in the NAND drive business, so we're still in the business.
Here's one. You warned Kodak early. Any idea why they didn't use that to their advantage?
That was one of the most fun meetings I've ever been in, because you go to a company who bought a lot of the silver in the world, and they have chemical engineers as their hierarchy of the company. And at the time, they were actually trying to make a decision whether to be in the printer business or not. And we came in with a Hitachi CCD camera with a flash module, took pictures of the people in the room, edited, displayed it, and basically told them in the back half of the 90s, this is going to blow through your industry and you won't be able to do anything about it, so why don't you come with us? And we actually said, let's do one for the United States, okay? And They did try. I think part of the dilemma for them, you could see what the struggle they had, and I hope this is on camera, so I have to be careful, I guess.
Yes,
but
be careful.
Yes. They made their money off of the paper. And you were coming up with something that allowed people to print their own pictures. So they struggled with the business model of trying to maintain keeping Kodak paper on a forefront of customer usage. And so you saw some of the original things that they were doing where you went to the store, took your cartridge in and uploaded it, and they would print it out to try to do that. And other companies, once it became clear that this technology was going to revolutionize photography, didn't have that same constraint.
Kodak was, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt, but Kodak to me was very much like the US Navy when we went from sailing ships to steamships. What do you think the admirals insisted on every single one of the steamships having on it during this transition?
Sales.
Sales. Very much like Kodak. Yeah. Kodak was just wedded to its chemical business. And even though Bruce and the team you worked with had come up with a working digital camera.
Oh, they were shipping it. They were in production.
Yeah, but then they shipped the guy off to Japan and kind of disbanded the project. You know?
We eventually did go to Casio and Olympus and all the other people. So.
Okay, I've got time for one or two more questions. When will we have fast enough flash to have PCs that don't need to be booted?
I think that the memory is fast enough, it's not cheap enough. Yeah. So it needs another order of magnitude drop in price for you to have enough for that.
So if DRAM SIMs could, if a flash SIM could replace a DRAM SIM in your system for the same cost per bit, then it would occur?
Well, no, it's beyond that. It's just that it's a chicken and egg. The basic problem is to do that needs a system architecture change. Right. But the system architecture change will only come about when Microsoft and Intel sees cheap enough memory. So you need to have sort of the memory to go first, and then they will jump into
You mean to supersede the drive from which you're booting?
It's more complicated. Yes.
It's more complicated, but to the end, I know that personally that they are working on systems like this, but they all want to wait for the memory to be cheap enough, the random access memory.
Just to add to that, Jeff Hawkins, you may know, and he was the CTO of Grid at the time. We went to Microsoft to try to get them to work on such a system concept. And we also went to Gates and convinced them. And they came up with a flash filing system, I think it was incorporated in WinPad, if you guys remember this. But the legacy of dealing with all the software out there that requires byte alterability and symmetry is not trivial. You can work around it. It's not that onerous, and it is something you can build a system as you're describing, and I hope to see that happening. But that was the original thinking when we saw the technology in '86, was to build systems that way. So you could have a cheaper, lighter, instant on, lower power computing system. And I think the technology that Stefan's working on is going to help reduce the barriers for getting the software industry to migrate. You still have to provide for legacy.
There's a sub-question to that. When do we expect that to happen, Stefan?
It's market and technology interacting with each other. Unfortunately, these days, the funding that's required for the technology develop is not there, and the market is waiting for the technology to be ready. So it's part of the casualty of the current environment.
Those things usually take up to a decade.
I hope it will be faster.
Well, I've got some more questions here, but we've used up our allotted time. So if you've asked a question that hasn't been answered and you feel a burning need for it, come on up. We'll be around here a little bit afterward.
I'm sneaking up behind you, Jeff, as you're talking about that. First of all, would you please join me in thanking our panel today?
Thank you, panel.
was really fantastic, and a little known story, I think, as well as you told it. And it's also a reminder of how fast an hour can go when we have a subject like this. So thanks very much for being here, and thanks to you, Jeff, for putting it together. If I could just thank a few more people and then give you a little list of upcoming events, and then we'll wrap up. First of all, I want to thank Rosemary Rameli and David Laws, who are the staff directors of the SemiSig, who've done so much to put this program